It all started with a sound, a faint noise, barely audible over the usual creaks and groans of the old house settling at night. At first, I thought it might have been the wind pushing through the trees outside, but something about it lingered in my mind. It wasn't like the usual nighttime noises we'd gotten used to living so far from town. This was different. It was almost human. The more I listened, the more it started to sound like a distant cry, soft but unmistakable, cutting through the stillness. I didn't mention it to my wife Sarah at first. I figured I was just hearing things, or maybe I wanted to believe that. Days passed, and I couldn't shake it. The sound returned night after night, always around the same time. I'd be sitting at the kitchen table, sipping on my coffee, the house already asleep, and there it was. Faint, like it was just on the edge of the woods. Our son Jake was too young to notice, or at least I thought so. But one evening, as I was tucking him into bed, he looked at me, eyes wide, and said, "Dad, do you hear the baby crying outside?" My heart stopped for a second. I hadn't told anyone about the noise. I forced a smile and told him it was probably just animals. But inside, something shifted. If he was hearing it too, then it wasn't just in my head. After that, things began to escalate. I started waking up in the middle of the night for no reason, drenched in sweat. Every creak in the house felt wrong. Every shadow stretching across the walls seemed to move just a little too quickly. Sarah could tell something was off. She'd ask if I was sleeping all right, but I shrugged it off. How could I explain that the nights felt wrong? That there was a kind of pressure in the air, like something was watching us? Instead, I kept my mouth shut and tried to ignore the growing sense of unease gnawing at me. One night, after hearing the sound again, closer this time, I decided to check it out. I grabbed my flashlight and headed out to the tree line. The night was thick, the air clinging to my skin, heavy and damp. As I walked, my boots crunched against the dry grass, the only noise breaking the stillness. I reached the edge of the woods and just stood there, scanning the darkness. That's when I saw them. Deep scratches, like claw marks, gouged into the bark of the nearest tree. They were fresh, too. I could feel it in my gut. It wasn't just the scratches that rattled me, though. Beneath the tree, in the underbrush, I noticed something else. Piles of small bones, neatly arranged in a pattern I couldn't make sense of. It wasn't random. Someone, or something, had done this intentionally. I backed away, flashlight shaking in my hand. I knew I should have turned around right then, but a part of me couldn't stop looking. The marks on the trees, the bones, it all felt like a warning, or maybe an invitation. I didn't tell Sarah about what I found. How could I? What would I even say? Instead, I convinced myself it was some animal's nest or some weird prank. But deep down, I knew better. A few nights later, Jake came running into our room, his face pale, his eyes wild. "They're watching me, Dad," from the window. I rushed into his room, heart pounding, and yanked the curtains aside. Nothing. Just the still, dark night. I knelt by Jake's bed, trying to calm him, but I couldn't shake the cold feeling crawling up my spine. Was he seeing things, or was there really someone out there? The next night, I stayed up again. This time, I heard more than just the crying. It was a low, distant hum, like chanting, coming from deep in the woods. I couldn't make out any words, but it sent chills through me. I didn't go outside that time. I wasn't ready to face whatever it was lurking out there. Instead, I sat in the dark, gripping the edge of my seat, waiting for it to stop. But it didn't. It just faded slowly, like it was receding back into the forest, leaving me wide awake and staring into the blackness. I'm not a superstitious man, never was. But after that night, I started to question everything. The sounds, the scratches, the bones, none of it made sense. Something was happening on our land, something I couldn't explain. After that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us. It wasn't just the sounds anymore. It was the way the air felt when I stepped outside, like there were eyes in the dark, tracking my every move. Even during the day, the house felt different, like it didn't belong to us anymore. I could see it in Sarah too. She didn't say much, but I noticed the way her gaze lingered on the windows, as if she was expecting to see something out there, just beyond the glass. Jake, though, he was the one I was worried about. He stopped sleeping through the night, waking up more often with those same wide eyes, muttering about people outside. "They're still there, Dad," he'd whisper, his little voice trembling. I tried to reassure him, but I didn't believe my own words. Every night I'd check the windows, and every night there was nothing. Nothing visible anyway. But it didn't feel empty. One evening, as the sun was setting, I heard the crying again, clearer this time. It sounded closer, almost like it was coming from the edge of the yard. I stood at the back door listening, my heart thudding in my chest. "You hear that?" I asked Sarah, hoping, just for a second, that maybe I'd imagined it. She nodded slowly, her face pale. "Rick, what the hell is that?" She didn't sound scared, not exactly, more like she was trying to make sense of something that shouldn't be there. But how could I answer her when I didn't know myself? I grabbed the flashlight and headed out again. The grass crunched under my boots, each step louder than I expected. The crying had stopped, but I couldn't shake the feeling it was still out there, just waiting. I made it to the tree line and scanned the area, but there was nothing unusual at first. Then, to my left, a figure moved between the trees, just a shadow, slipping out of view before I could get a good look. My heart raced, but I kept walking, forcing myself deeper into the woods. It was darker in there than it should have been. The trees seemed to crowd in around me, their branches hanging low, like they were trying to trap me beneath them. I found more scratches on the trunks, deeper this time, like something had been clawing at them in a frenzy. The bones were still there too, but now they were scattered, like someone or something had been messing with them. I crouched down, my hand hovering over one of the small skulls. It was too clean, too perfectly arranged before. Now, it looked like a warning. I heard a rustle behind me. My heart jumped into my throat as I spun around, shining the flashlight into the trees. Nothing. But I knew I wasn't alone. I could feel it. My mind raced, every instinct screaming at me to run, but I stayed frozen, listening. The rustling came again, closer this time. I backed away slowly, my legs trembling. Something moved in the darkness, just at the edge of my light. I barely caught it. A pale face, eyes too wide, watching me. I turned and bolted, crashing through the underbrush, not caring about the noise I was making. By the time I got back to the house, I was out of breath, my hands shaking. Sarah was at the door, her face a mix of relief and confusion. "What happened? What did you see?" I couldn't bring myself to tell her. How could I? I wasn't even sure what I saw myself. Instead, I just shook my head and muttered, "We need to leave." We packed the next day. It was quiet, unnervingly so. Jake kept asking why we were going, and all I could say was that we needed a break from the farm, a little vacation. But deep down, I knew we weren't coming back. I could see the relief in Sarah's eyes, even if she didn't say it. She felt it too, the wrongness that had seeped into the house, the land. Whatever it wasn't just going to let us live peacefully anymore. As we drove away, I couldn't stop myself from glancing back at the house. For a split second, I thought I saw something standing by the trees, watching us go. A tall figure, still and silent, but when I blinked, it was gone. I told myself it was just my imagination, but part of me knew better. Something had been out there all along, and I had the sinking feeling that wherever we went, it might not be finished with us yet. After we left the farm, I thought maybe things would settle. We rented a small house on the outskirts of town, just until we figured out what to do next. Sarah seemed calmer, and Jake was back to sleeping through the night. For a few days, I almost convinced myself it was over, that whatever had been haunting us was tied to that land. But late one night, as I sat alone in the living room, that same sound returned, the faint, distant crying. I froze. It was impossible. We were miles away from the farm. How could it have followed us? I didn't wake Sarah. I didn't even move at first. I just sat there, staring out the window into the darkness, listening. The crying wasn't loud, but it was persistent, like it was waiting for me to acknowledge it. I tried to tell myself it was a coincidence, that maybe a neighbor's kid was crying, or that my mind was playing tricks. But deep down, I knew better. I grabbed my jacket and stepped outside, my breath clouding in the cold air. Everything looked normal, the quiet street, the dim glow of the porch light. But that crying, it felt closer now, like it was coming from just beyond the yard. I walked toward the sound, my footsteps crunching on the gravel. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up the further I went. There was nothing, no movement, no sign of anything wrong. But the crying, it seemed to be coming from nowhere and everywhere at once. I turned around, and for a split second, I thought I saw something at the end of the street. A figure, standing perfectly still. My stomach tightened, and I blinked, but when I looked again, it was gone. Back inside, I sat on the edge of the couch, my mind racing. What did it want? Why hadn't it stayed at the farm? I felt trapped, like no matter where we went, it was always going to find us. Sarah stirred in the bedroom, and I forced myself to calm down. She couldn't know. She deserved to believe we'd escaped it, but I couldn't stop the thoughts racing through my head. What if it wasn't the land at all? What if it was after me? A few nights later, Jake came to me again. He didn't say anything at first, just stood in the doorway of our room, pale and quiet. "They're here," he whispered finally. I sat up, my heart pounding. "Who's here, buddy?" He pointed to the window. "The people from the farm. They followed us." I wanted to tell him he was wrong, to reassure him, but all I could do was pull him close and stare at the window, half expecting to see those same figures from the woods. There was nothing, but I couldn't shake the feeling that Jake was right. I started staying up late again, waiting for something to happen. The crying returned every night, always at the same time, but now it was louder, closer. One night, I stood by the window, watching the street. I couldn't see anything, but I could feel it, the presence, waiting just outside. I gripped the curtains tightly, trying to make sense of the shadows dancing under the streetlights. "What do you want from us?" I muttered under my breath, but of course there was no answer. Just that constant, haunting sound. Days blurred into nights. I barely slept, jumping at every noise, every flicker of movement. Sarah knew something was wrong, but I couldn't bring myself to tell her. How do you explain to someone that something is following you, something you can't see or touch, but you know is there? I was losing it. I could feel myself unraveling, becoming paranoid, afraid to leave the house, afraid to stay in it. One night, I found myself back outside, staring at the empty street. The crying had stopped, but the absence of it was somehow worse. I walked aimlessly, half hoping to see something, half terrified of what I might find. As I turned the corner, I froze. Standing at the edge of the woods, barely visible in the moonlight, was a figure. It was taller than any person should be, its limbs too long, too thin. My throat tightened, and for a moment I couldn't breathe. I stumbled back, my chest pounding, but when I looked again, it was gone. I didn't tell Sarah about it. I didn't tell anyone, but I knew it wasn't over. Whatever had followed us from the farm, it wasn't finished. I couldn't stop thinking about that figure. The way it had just stood there, motionless, too tall to be human, but somehow too real to dismiss. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw it, looming at the edge of the woods, waiting. I didn't tell Sarah. I couldn't. She was already holding on by a thread, and if she knew what I'd seen, what I thought I'd seen, she'd fall apart. I had to keep it together for her, for Jake. But it was getting harder to pretend that everything was normal. The crying had stopped after that night, but the house felt different, like something had shifted. I started waking up in the middle of the night, heart racing, convinced I heard footsteps outside the window. I'd get up, creep to the glass, and peer out, expecting to see that figure again. But there was nothing. Just the empty street and the trees swaying in the breeze. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. That it was still out there, waiting for the right moment to come back. Jake was quieter than usual. He didn't say much anymore, just sat by the window, staring out like he was waiting for something. Every now and then, he'd ask me if we were going back to the farm. I told him no, not now, maybe never. But his eyes never left the window. They liked it there, he'd say, almost to himself. I didn't have the heart to ask who he meant. One afternoon, I decided to go back to the farm. Sarah was out with Jake, and I couldn't get the thought out of my head. Maybe if I went back, if I faced whatever it was, I could finally get some answers. I packed a bag, just the essentials, and drove out there, my hands gripping the wheel tighter than they should have been. The drive felt longer than I remembered, the road winding through the countryside like it was leading me somewhere I wasn't supposed to go. When I finally pulled up to the house, it looked smaller, abandoned. The grass had grown wild, the windows were dark. I stood there for a long time, just staring at it, wondering why we ever thought this place could have been home. The woods beyond the house seemed thicker, more oppressive, as if they were closing in. I couldn't see the scratches on the trees from where I stood, but I knew they were still there, waiting. I walked around the property, my footsteps crunching on the dry grass. Everything felt wrong. The air, the light, the way the shadows seemed to stretch longer than they should. I made my way to the edge of the woods, and as I stepped closer, I saw something that stopped me cold. The bones were back, arranged neatly in the same strange pattern I'd found before. But this time, there were more, a lot more. And in the center of the pile, there was something new, a small weathered doll, half buried in the dirt. I knelt down, my hands shaking as I reached for the doll. It felt cold, too cold for the warm day. I turned it over, and that's when I saw it. My son's name, Jake, carved into the back of its head. My breath caught in my throat, and I dropped the doll like it had burned me. How could it have his name? We'd never been back here since we left. How did they know? I backed away from the bones, my heart pounding in my chest. I needed to leave, now. But as I turned to head back to the car, I saw it again. The figure, standing at the tree line, just watching. This time it was closer, its form clearer in the dimming light. Its face, if you could call it that, was pale, featureless, just a blank canvas where eyes and a mouth should have been. My legs felt heavy, like they didn't want to move, but I forced myself to run. I stumbled through the yard, my vision blurring as I fought to stay upright. I reached the car, fumbling with the keys, my hands slick with sweat. I glanced over my shoulder, but the figure was gone. I didn't wait to see if it would come back. I started the car and tore down the driveway, not looking back. The entire way home, my mind raced. Why Jake's name? What did they want with him? With us? When I got back to the house, Sarah knew something was wrong. She didn't ask, just hugged me, but I could tell she felt it too. Whatever this was, it wasn't over. I'd brought it back with me. And now, it wasn't just the farm, it was here. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every sound outside felt like it was crawling through the walls, wrapping around me. The hum of the heater, the creak of the floorboards, the faint rustle of leaves, it all seemed too deliberate, like something was trying to get in. Sarah was asleep beside me, her breathing steady, and I wondered how she could stay so calm. Maybe she was pretending, just like I was, both of us trying to convince ourselves that we'd left the worst behind. But I knew better. Whatever this thing was, it wasn't done with us yet. Around midnight, I heard footsteps, light, cautious, but unmistakable. They came from the hallway, the kind of steps someone takes when they don't want to be noticed. My heart sank. I sat up, straining to listen. The sound stopped just outside our door. I held my breath, waiting, praying it was just Jake up for a glass of water. But the door didn't open. There was no knock, nothing. The footsteps just lingered there, like they were listening. I slipped out of bed, moving quietly so I wouldn't wake Sarah. My hand brushed the cold doorknob, and for a moment I hesitated. I knew what I'd see, or rather, I knew what I wouldn't see. But I had to look. I opened the door slowly, and sure enough, the hallway was empty. But the air felt heavy, like someone had been standing there moments before. My eyes drifted toward Jake's room at the end of the hall. The door was slightly ajar, a crack of light spilling into the darkness. I made my way to his room, heart pounding harder with each step. I nudged the door open with my foot, and there he was, sitting on his bed, wide awake, staring out the window. "Jake?" I whispered, stepping closer. He didn't turn around. His eyes were locked on something outside. I moved to his side, following his gaze. For a second, I saw nothing but the empty street below. Then, just at the edge of the yard, I spotted it, the figure, standing still, watching, its pale, featureless face reflecting the dim streetlight. "Do you see them, Dad?" Jake asked, his voice flat, distant. I wanted to tell him no, to lie, but what was the point? "Yeah, buddy," I whispered, my throat tight. "I see them." We watched the figure for what felt like hours, but it never moved. Just stood there, motionless, like it was waiting for something. I wanted to grab Jake, to get him away from the window, but my feet wouldn't move. I couldn't look away. The thing outside, it wasn't just a shadow or some trick of the light. It was real, and it had followed us. It wasn't going to leave this time. Then Jake turned to me, his face pale, his eyes empty. "They want me to go with them," he said quietly, like it was the most natural thing in the world. My blood ran cold. "What are you talking about?" I knelt beside him, my hands gripping his shoulders. "You're not going anywhere. Do you hear me?" They said they've been waiting. His voice was so calm, so detached, like he wasn't even scared. They said it's time. I shook my head, my chest tightening with panic. No, Jake, they're not real. We're leaving here tomorrow and they won't follow us. They can't. But even as I said the words, I knew I didn't believe them. Jake just looked back at the window, like he already knew something I didn't. You can't leave, Dad. They're part of us now. They've always been here. A chill ran through me, deeper than anything I'd ever felt. I stood up, pulling Jake away from the window, and closed the curtains, my hands shaking. Get back to bed, I said, my voice harsher than I meant. He didn't argue, just crawled under the covers, his eyes still fixed on the window. I stayed up the rest of the night, sitting in the living room, watching the door, waiting for something to happen. But nothing did. No footsteps, no voices, no movement outside. Just the unbearable weight of knowing that, somehow, it wasn't over. Jake's words kept playing in my mind, over and over. They're part of us now. The next morning, we packed up. I didn't say much to Sarah, just told her we needed to get away for a while. As we were leaving, I noticed Jake wasn't carrying any of his things, just standing by the car, his eyes on the horizon. Let's go, buddy, I called, trying to keep my voice steady. He turned to me, a strange, almost knowing smile on his face. They're coming with us, Dad. You know that, right? I didn't answer. I just stared at him, my hands tightening on the steering wheel, because deep down, I knew he was right. I was 12 when it happened. The memory is clear, like it's etched into my mind, every little detail. I was sitting on the edge of my dad's bed, talking about something unimportant, probably school or whatever was going on in my life back then. It was a normal evening, nothing unusual. My mom was in the closet, folding clothes. She always did that around this time, after dinner, tidying things up before bed. The room was quiet, aside from our conversation, and the dim light cast shadows on the walls. I remember feeling completely at ease. The closet door was open just enough for me to see her. She was standing there, not saying anything, just going about her routine. My dad, sitting across from me in his chair, glanced over at her and asked a question. Something simple, like, "Do you need help with that?" No response. He raised his voice a little, still nothing. I noticed the slight frown on his face, the way his eyes lingered on her. That's when the air in the room shifted, not in a dramatic way, but I could sense something was off. "Hey, did you hear me?" he asked, louder this time, turning fully toward the closet. I looked over at her too, but she didn't even flinch, just kept folding. It struck me as odd. My mom wasn't the type to ignore anyone, especially not my dad. I figured maybe she was deep in thought or something. My dad, though, wasn't as patient. He stood up, his voice getting sharper. "Are you going to answer me or not?" I could hear the edge in his tone, and it made me uneasy. I watched him step toward the closet, and I could feel a knot tightening in my chest. Something wasn't right, but I couldn't put my finger on it. My mom's movements were so mechanical, like she wasn't really there, just going through the motions. My dad reached the doorframe and was about to say something when we both froze. The sound of the bathroom door opening caught our attention, and there she was, my mom, standing in the doorway, wrapped in a towel, her hair wet. For a second, I couldn't process what I was seeing. I glanced back at the closet, where the figure that had been folding clothes was now gone, just an empty space with nothing but darkness. My dad didn't say a word, and neither did I. We just stared at each other, confused, scared even, though neither of us wanted to admit it. I could feel my heart pounding, my mind racing to make sense of it all. "What? Why were you yelling my name?" my mom asked, stepping further into the room, completely oblivious to what had just happened. I looked at her, then at my dad. He was pale, like all the color had drained from his face. "I thought you were in the closet," he muttered, his voice low, almost shaky. My mom furrowed her brow, clearly not understanding what he was talking about. I couldn't shake the image of her, or whatever it was, in the closet. The way she moved, so familiar, yet wrong. My dad tried to play it off, brushing past it like it didn't matter, but I could tell he was rattled. We didn't talk about it again that night. My mom went on with her evening like nothing strange had happened, but I stayed quiet, trying to convince myself it was just a trick of the light, or maybe my mind playing games with me. As I lay in bed that night, the room felt colder than usual, and every little sound seemed louder, like the house itself was listening. I kept replaying the moment in my head, seeing her in the closet, then seeing her in the doorway. It didn't make sense, and the more I thought about it, the more it scared me. The next morning, I didn't bring it up, but the memory of that night sat with me, heavy and persistent. At breakfast, my dad acted like nothing had happened, and I couldn't tell if he was pretending or if he really believed it was just some strange coincidence. My mom was her usual self, making coffee and humming to herself. I kept glancing at her, looking for anything, some subtle sign that she had noticed something was wrong too. But she didn't. She was completely unaware. As I sat there, eating cereal, my mind drifted back to the closet. I couldn't shake the image of her in there, folding clothes, her back to us. The way she moved, it was exactly like my mom, but it wasn't her. That fact gnawed at me. I kept trying to think of an explanation, but none of it made sense. People don't just appear and disappear like that. Not in real life. The day passed, but my thoughts were stuck on that moment. I stayed close to my dad, hoping he might bring it up, even in passing. He didn't. Maybe he was trying to protect me, or maybe he didn't want to deal with it himself. Either way, it left me alone with my thoughts, which kept circling back to that dark closet and the figure that stood inside it. I couldn't tell if it was fear or curiosity that kept me thinking about it. Maybe both. Later that night, I found myself avoiding my parents' room altogether. The thought of looking at the closet again made my skin crawl. I didn't want to see it empty, but I also didn't want to see her standing there again. It felt like the room had changed, like it was holding something back that I wasn't ready to face. I didn't tell my parents, but I slept with the lights on that night. Over the next few days, things started to settle back into their normal rhythm, at least for everyone else. I went to school, did my homework, and tried to convince myself that I had just imagined the whole thing. But deep down, I knew I hadn't. My dad had seen it too. That's what scared me the most. If it was just me, I could chalk it up to my imagination. But we had both seen the same thing. One evening, a few weeks later, my dad finally said something. We were sitting in the living room, watching TV, when he turned to me out of nowhere and said, "That night, I don't know what we saw, but it wasn't your mom." His voice was low, almost like he didn't want anyone else to hear. There was a tightness in his expression, something I hadn't seen before. It was a rare moment of honesty, and it made my heart race. I didn't know what to say. I had been waiting for him to acknowledge it, but now that he had, I wasn't sure how to respond. "Do you think it'll happen again?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. I didn't want to know the answer, but at the same time, I needed to know. He shook his head slowly, staring at the TV like he could find some answer there. "I hope not," he said quietly. That night, I kept replaying his words in my head. The way he said, "It wasn't your mom," it made everything feel more real, like I hadn't just imagined it, like something else had been in that closet. I started avoiding the hallway that led to my parents' room, always taking the long way around the house. It seemed silly, but I couldn't help it. Every time I got close to that room, I felt uneasy, like something was watching me, waiting for me to get closer. Days turned into weeks, and nothing else happened. But the fear never really went away. I kept waiting for something to change, for another sign that whatever we had seen wasn't just a one-time thing. I didn't tell anyone else, not even my friends. It felt too strange to explain, and I wasn't even sure I wanted to relive it by talking about it. But deep down, I knew that wasn't the end of it. A few months passed, and life went on as if nothing had happened. But I could never shake the feeling that something was off in the house. Even on the brightest days, there was this lingering sense that something had shifted, like an unseen shadow that followed me from room to room. My dad never brought it up again, and neither did I. We had fallen into this unspoken agreement to pretend like that night was just some weird fluke, an incident best forgotten. Then, one night, it happened again. I was in my room, trying to focus on my homework, when I heard it, the unmistakable sound of my mom's voice calling my name. It came from the direction of my parents' room, faint but clear. I paused, my pencil hovering above the paper, listening. It wasn't unusual for her to call me, but something about the tone seemed wrong, like it was distant, almost hollow. I stood up, heart pounding, and walked toward their room. My dad wasn't home yet, working late again, and the house felt unusually still. As I approached the door, I could hear her voice more clearly, still calling my name, but there was a strange echo to it. I stepped into the room, and there, in the same spot as before, was my mom, or at least something that looked exactly like her. She was standing in front of the closet, just like last time, her back to me, folding clothes with that same calm, mechanical motion. My mind raced. I could hear the shower running in the bathroom, and I knew my real mom was in there. My chest tightened as I tried to make sense of it. How could this be happening again? I took a step closer, the floor creaking beneath my feet. The figure didn't move, didn't acknowledge me. "Mom?" I whispered, my voice trembling, but the word barely escaped my throat. The figure kept folding clothes, its movements steady and unbroken, like I wasn't even there. My palms felt slick with sweat, and a chill ran down my arms despite the warmth of the house. My legs felt like they were made of lead, but I forced myself to move, inching toward the bathroom door. I knocked, trying to keep my voice steady. "Mom, are you in there?" The water stopped, and a moment later, the door opened. There she was. My real mom, towel wrapped around her, hair wet, looking at me with confusion. "What's wrong?" she asked, her brow furrowed. I couldn't answer. My eyes flicked between her and the figure by the closet, still standing there, still moving in that strange, detached way. Who is that?" I managed to say, my voice barely audible. My mom looked at me like I was crazy, and when she followed my gaze to the closet, her face paled. She didn't say a word. In that moment, everything felt like it was crashing down. The air between us was thick with the weight of what we were both seeing, but neither of us could bring ourselves to acknowledge it. It was like time had slowed down, and we were stuck in this impossible situation with no way out. My mom took a step forward, and I instinctively grabbed her arm, holding her back. "Don't," I whispered, the fear choking me. But she didn't listen. She moved closer to the figure, reaching out a hand as if to touch it. My heart pounded so loudly in my ears I thought I might pass out. I wanted to scream, to pull her back, but I couldn't move, couldn't speak. And then, just as her hand was about to make contact, the figure vanished. It didn't fade or dissolve, it was just gone. 1 second it was there, and the next, the space was empty, like it had never been there at all. My mom stood frozen, her hand still outstretched, staring at the now empty closet. Neither of us said anything. What could we say? For the rest of the night, we didn't talk about it. My mom stayed close to me, sitting on the couch, flipping through channels on the TV without really watching. I knew she was trying to distract herself, to pretend like everything was fine, but I could see the fear in her eyes, the way her hands trembled ever so slightly. Whatever we had seen, it wasn't over. I could feel it. We both knew that this was only the beginning. The days after that second encounter felt strange. There was this tension that lingered in the air, even though no one said anything about what had happened. My mom and I acted like it was normal to avoid certain parts of the house, like the closet in my parents' room. It had become something we tiptoed around, literally and figuratively. And still, the image of that figure folding clothes with its back to me stayed in my mind like an afterimage burned into my brain. I started to question myself. Was it possible we were just seeing things? Maybe it was some kind of weird shared hallucination. But every time I brought it up, I'd remember how real it felt, how solid that figure had been. I could feel the panic rising in me just thinking about it. My mom must have been thinking the same thing, but every time I tried to ask her, she'd brush it off. "It's nothing," she'd say, almost too quickly, her eyes avoiding mine. One night, maybe a week later, I woke up to the sound of something moving downstairs. It wasn't loud, just soft enough to make me sit up in bed, straining to hear. My room was dark, but the glow from the streetlights outside crept through the blinds, casting long, faint shadows across the floor. I listened harder. It was a rhythmic sound, almost like someone walking, but slow, deliberate. I got out of bed, my heart already picking up speed. I couldn't help but think of the figure again, and a cold sweat broke out on the back of my neck. I quietly opened my door and stepped into the hallway. Everything seemed normal, but the sound was definitely coming from downstairs. I hesitated for a moment, wondering if I should wake my parents, but something pulled me forward. It was that same curiosity that had gotten me into trouble before, the kind that made me want to see what was happening, even though every part of me was telling me to turn back. As I made my way down the stairs, the sound became clearer. Footsteps shuffling back and forth. It was coming from the living room. My fingers grazed the wall as I descended, grounding me, as though the touch of something solid could keep my mind from racing. When I reached the bottom step, I paused, feeling a lump form in my throat. I could see the faint outline of someone standing in the living room, their silhouette barely visible in the dim light coming from the kitchen. My mom? My dad? No, it couldn't be. The figure was just standing there, unmoving now, like it was waiting for something. My skin prickled as I realized it was standing in front of the couch, the exact same spot where I'd seen my mom folding clothes before. I opened my mouth to call out, but no sound came. My body refused to move, like I was frozen to the spot. The figure shifted slightly, as though it had sensed me, and my breath caught in my throat. I felt a sudden wave of panic, a tightness in my chest that was almost unbearable. I wanted to scream, to turn and run, but I couldn't take my eyes off of it. Then, without warning, the figure took a step forward. My heart nearly stopped. I was about to bolt back up the stairs when I heard a voice. "Honey?" It was my mom, from behind me at the top of the stairs. I whipped around, my breath ragged, and there she was, standing in her robe, looking down at me with concern. "What are you doing down here?" I turned back to the living room, my pulse racing, but the figure was gone. The room was empty, just like that night in her bedroom. I thought I heard something," I stammered, trying to catch my breath, my legs shaking beneath me. She frowned, stepping down a few steps toward me. "Come back to bed," she said softly, but her eyes darted to the living room, just for a second. I could see the fear in her, even though she tried to hide it. We never talked about it the next day. Just like before, it became another thing we pretended didn't happen. But I knew, deep down, that whatever it was in the house, it was still there. And it was getting bolder. A few days after the night in the living room, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was waiting for me. I'd catch glimpses of movement out of the corner of my eye. Just shadows, I told myself. But they felt too deliberate to be my imagination. It was small things at first, like noticing the curtains swaying when the windows were shut, or hearing the faintest creak of floorboards from the hallway when no one was there. I'd pause, heart pounding, trying to convince myself it was nothing. One evening, my mom asked if I could help her clean out the attic. I hadn't been up there in years. It wasn't a place we used often, just a storage space filled with old boxes and things we didn't need anymore. But something about the attic always unsettled me. As I followed her up the narrow stairs, a wave of unease hit me. I couldn't explain it, but the air felt different as soon as we stepped through the door. The attic was cluttered, but it wasn't the mess that bothered me. It was the sense that we weren't alone. I helped her pull down boxes, sorting through old toys and photo albums. The light from the single bulb flickered occasionally, casting strange shadows that stretched and twisted across the room. I tried to ignore it, focusing on the task at hand, but my eyes kept darting to the far corner, where the shadows seemed to linger longer than they should. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us. "What's in those boxes?" I asked, pointing to a stack near the corner. They were covered in a thick layer of dust, untouched for years. My mom glanced at them, her face suddenly hard to read. "Just old things from before we moved here," she said, her voice tight. She didn't elaborate, and I didn't press her, but a strange tension filled the space between us. As we continued working, I noticed something odd. One of the boxes had a name written on it, Elizabeth. My mom hadn't mentioned anyone by that name before. "Who's Elizabeth?" I asked, my voice sounding too loud in the stillness of the attic. My mom froze, her back to me. For a long moment, she didn't say anything, and when she finally turned around, her face was pale. "No one," she said quickly. Too quickly. "Just a relative." I didn't believe her. There was something in her eyes, something she was hiding. My heart began to race as I stared at the box, the name glaring back at me. I wanted to ask more, but the look on her face stopped me cold. It was fear, real fear, and that scared me more than anything. We finished up, but that name Elizabeth kept gnawing at me. Later that night, I lay in bed, unable to sleep. I couldn't stop thinking about it. Who was she? Why did my mom react like that? I tossed and turned, my mind racing with possibilities, until finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I had to know. Quietly, I slipped out of bed and crept back up to the attic. The house was silent as I climbed the stairs, every creak of the wood making my skin crawl. When I reached the attic, the air felt even heavier than before, like the room itself was holding its breath. I flicked on the light, and it buzzed softly above me. I headed straight for the corner, my eyes locked on that box. I knelt down, brushing away the dust. My hands shook as I lifted the lid. Inside were old photographs, black and white, faded with age. A woman stared back at me from one of them. She looked familiar, her eyes cold, distant. I shuffled through more pictures and stopped cold when I found one of her standing in front of a house. Our house. My pulse quickened. This wasn't just some random relative. This woman, Elizabeth, had lived here before us. Then I saw it. Another photo, but this one wasn't like the others. It was torn, and behind the rip, I could just make out the outline of someone else. A child, maybe. But her face had been violently scratched out. I felt sick, my stomach twisting as I stared at the ruined photo. Why had my mom never mentioned this? Who was this child, and what had happened to her? Suddenly, I heard a soft noise behind me, like a whisper, but too quiet to make out the words. I froze, every hair on my body standing on end. Slowly, I turned my head toward the corner of the attic, where the shadows were darker now, impossibly deep. And there, standing in the gloom, was the figure. It wasn't moving, but I could feel it watching me, just like before. My throat went dry as I backed away, my heart slamming against my ribs. The figure stepped forward, its form becoming clearer in the dim light. My breath caught in my chest as I realized something horrible. The figure wasn't Elizabeth. It was the child from the photo, her face twisted in anger, her eyes burning with a fury that made my blood run cold. I turned and ran, stumbling down the stairs, my heart racing, but the image of that child burned into my mind. I had my answer, but it wasn't what I wanted. I didn't know who Elizabeth was, but I knew one thing for sure. Whatever had happened in this house before, it wasn't over. Not even close. I always thought stories about haunted places were just that, stories. But then I found myself at the Hotel del Salto in Colombia, standing before something that felt far too real to dismiss as a local legend. The first thing that hit me wasn't the architecture or even the chilling history of the place. It was the sight of the falls. The Tequendama Falls roared in the distance, their mist rising like smoke, constantly shifting, hiding something beneath. I couldn't shake the feeling that the water itself held secrets, too old and heavy to surface. As I stepped inside the hotel, I noticed the walls, once grand and polished, were now fading with age. Time had clearly taken its toll here, but there was something more, something lurking beneath the decay, as if the very structure had absorbed the tragedies that occurred within. The guide began talking about the history, mentioning how it was built in 1923, a luxurious escape for the wealthy, designed by the renowned Carlos Arturo Tapias. But all I could think about were the stories I'd read before coming, the ones about people leaping to their deaths. It was too easy to imagine, standing so close to the edge of those cliffs. The tour continued, but I found myself lagging behind. The farther we walked, the colder it seemed to get. There was no breeze, yet the air clung to my skin in a way that made me feel watched, like something unseen was just behind me, waiting. I glanced over my shoulder more times than I'd cared to admit, but every time I did, there was nothing but empty corridors and peeling wallpaper. "Do you hear that?" I asked a woman next to me, trying to sound casual. She frowned, shook her head, and walked away, clearly unimpressed. But I knew I wasn't imagining it. It was faint, barely more than a murmur, like distant voices coming from where? Below? Behind the walls? I tried to follow the guide's explanations, but my mind kept drifting back to those whispers. I told myself it was just the atmosphere. These kinds of places had a way of playing tricks on people. But as we reached the main balcony overlooking the falls, I couldn't deny the pull I felt. The guide paused, letting us take in the view, but my attention was drawn to the edge. Standing there, looking out, I felt it, a strange urge to step closer. It wasn't suicidal, more like curiosity, as if the falls were calling, daring me to come nearer. My hand gripped the railing, knuckles white. "You okay?" the guide asked, and I quickly stepped back, forcing a smile. "Yeah, just soaking it all in," I muttered. But my heart was racing. I couldn't explain why. I had no reason to feel that way, but the feeling lingered. Something wasn't right about this place. I tried to focus on the rest of the tour, but my thoughts kept circling back. I remembered the legend of the Muisca tribe, how they supposedly leapt from these cliffs centuries ago, escaping the Spanish. It wasn't just the hotel's history that felt heavy, it was the land itself. What had those people felt in their final moments? Desperation? Or was it something else entirely? By the time we finished the tour, I was more unsettled than when I'd arrived. The others seemed unaffected, laughing and chatting as they left the building, but I couldn't shake the sense that something was waiting here, watching us leave. It felt wrong to turn my back on it, like I was missing something important, something dangerous. Before I left, I took one last look at the falls from the hotel's entrance. The mist still swirled, and for a brief moment, I thought I saw something move within it, just at the edge of my vision. A figure, perhaps, or maybe just my nerves getting the best of me. I blinked, and it was gone. But that night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't help but wonder, what if the legends weren't just stories after all? That night, I couldn't sleep. The hotel, the falls, it all clung to me like a damp chill I couldn't shake. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that mist swirling, hiding something just beyond my reach. I tossed and turned, the sheets feeling too heavy, like they were weighing me down. The more I thought about it, the more convinced I became that I hadn't imagined that figure. It was there, waiting. By morning, I was restless. I grabbed my phone, thinking I'd search for more information on the place, maybe something the guide hadn't mentioned. The internet was full of speculation, rumors, stories of visitors feeling an overwhelming urge to jump, unexplained disappearances, even sightings of people who weren't really there. The more I read, the more I felt drawn back to the hotel. I didn't want to go, not really, but something inside me pushed, almost like the decision wasn't entirely my own. I found myself driving back before I could convince myself otherwise. The closer I got, the tighter my chest felt. The winding roads, the thick greenery that surrounded the area, it all seemed too quiet, too still, like the world itself was holding its breath. When the hotel finally came into view, it looked different, colder, emptier. I parked and just sat there for a moment, staring at it. The facade seemed to loom, the windows dark and unwelcoming, as if the building itself didn't want me back. I took a deep breath and stepped out of the car, my feet crunching against the gravel. There were no other tourists around this time, no groups of people to blend into, just me. And that was when I realized I wanted to be alone. It wasn't normal, but I couldn't help it. I needed to see the falls again. The path to the balcony felt longer this time, as if the corridors were stretching, leading me somewhere I shouldn't be going. My heart pounded in my chest, the sound of my footsteps echoing faintly off the walls. I told myself I was being ridiculous, that nothing had changed since yesterday, but the deeper I went, the more suffocating the atmosphere became. I couldn't stop glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone or something following me. When I reached the balcony, I froze. The mist over the falls was thicker than before, swirling in unnatural patterns, almost like it was alive. And then there it was again, that same figure. I blinked, my eyes trying to make sense of what I was seeing. It stood at the edge, just like I'd imagined before, but this time it didn't disappear. It was there, clearly, unmoving. A person. I felt a pull, an irresistible urge to move closer. I stepped forward, my hands gripping the railing as I leaned out. The figure didn't turn, didn't react to my presence. My heart raced, but not from fear. It was something else, something darker. For a moment, I understood why people jumped. It wasn't the falls, or the view, or the escape. It was a need, a compulsion. I don't know how long I stood there, staring at that figure, but when I finally stepped back, it was gone, vanished into the mist. My head spun, and I had to steady myself against the railing. This wasn't normal. Something was wrong with this place, with me. But even as that thought crossed my mind, I knew I wouldn't be able to stay away. I was already planning to come back, and that terrified me more than anything I'd seen. What was drawing me here? Was it the falls, the hotel, or something far older and more sinister, something tied to the land itself? The next day, I tried to shake it off. I told myself it was stress or just the power of suggestion from reading all those stories. But that didn't explain why I found myself driving back to the hotel once again. I didn't want to go, not consciously. Yet, here I was, gripping the steering wheel tighter with every mile I covered. It was like I was being pulled there, like the road was narrowing, leaving me with no choice but to return. The hotel looked even more desolate in the daylight. The sun was out, but it did nothing to cut through the oppressive atmosphere. I hesitated for a moment, standing by the entrance, debating whether to turn around. But the thought of leaving unsettled me in a way I couldn't explain. It was as if something unfinished lingered there, something that wanted me to come back. As I stepped inside, the familiar dampness hit me again, clinging to my skin. The air smelled old, like mold and decay, but beneath it was something else, something metallic. It reminded me of blood. The lobby was empty, just as I remembered, but the space felt different. It felt alive, like the walls were watching me, waiting for me to move. Every step echoed through the vast hall, the sound unnervingly loud. I wasn't sure where I was going, but I kept walking. Without realizing it, I found myself heading toward the stairs that led up to the old guest rooms. I hadn't planned to go there, but my legs moved on their own, like they knew the way. The staircase creaked beneath my feet, the wood groaning as if it hadn't been touched in years. The higher I went, the colder it became, and I couldn't help but feel like I was being followed. The hallway at the top was narrow, the faded wallpaper peeling away in long strips. The doors to the rooms were closed, and I had no intention of opening any of them. Something in my gut told me that whatever was behind those doors was best left alone. Still, the farther I walked, the heavier the atmosphere became. It pressed down on me, making it harder to breathe, like I was sinking into the floor with every step. Then I heard it. A faint sound, almost imperceptible, coming from the end of the hall. At first, I thought I was imagining things, but as I got closer, it grew louder. It was a soft, rhythmic thumping, like someone tapping their fingers against wood. My heart pounded in my ears, and I had to force myself to move forward. Every instinct screamed at me to turn around, to leave. But I couldn't. I had to see what it was. I reached the end of the hall, my hand trembling as I touched the doorknob. The tapping stopped. I froze, waiting for something, anything to happen, but there was only silence. Slowly, I turned the knob and pushed the door open. The room was empty. Dust hung in the air, and the only sound was my own breathing, shallow and uneven. But then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it. A figure standing at the window, staring out at the falls. I blinked, my body locking up in fear. The figure didn't move, didn't acknowledge me. It was just there, like it had always been there. My throat tightened, and I wanted to call out, but the words died before they reached my lips. I took a step back, and that's when the figure turned its head slowly, almost mechanically, to face me. There were no eyes, no features, just a blank, pale face staring right at me. I stumbled backward, my back hitting the wall behind me. I couldn't look away. It was as if the figure was pulling me in, forcing me to see it. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it was gone. The room was empty again, but the oppressive feeling remained. I ran out of there, not caring how loud my footsteps were, not looking back. I had seen enough, but as I reached the bottom of the stairs, something clicked in my mind. The figure hadn't been just looking at the falls, it had been looking at me, waiting for me. The next day, I found myself back at the Hotel del Salto, though I couldn't explain why. The previous night's events played in my head on a relentless loop. What was that figure? What did it want? The sun was shining bright, but it did nothing to lift the heaviness clinging to my chest. Every step toward the hotel felt like a decision made by someone else, not me. Walking through the entrance, I felt an odd chill. I wasn't sure if it was just my nerves or something else entirely. The lobby seemed unchanged, though the musty smell had grown stronger. I could almost taste the decay. My footsteps were too loud, echoing off the high ceilings and adding to the oppressive atmosphere. I headed towards the back office, hoping to find some answers, or at least someone who could offer a logical explanation. In the office, I found an elderly woman behind the counter. She was hunched over a stack of old papers, her eyes hidden behind thick glasses. She looked up as I approached, her gaze piercing. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice surprisingly steady given the surroundings. I introduced myself and explained that I was investigating the history of the hotel. Her expression didn't change, but I sensed a shift in her demeanor. "Many come here to learn about the past," she said. "Most leave with more questions than answers." Her tone was clipped, almost as if she was trying to push me away. "It's not always wise to dig too deep." Her words seemed more like a warning than advice. I wondered what she knew about the place that she wasn't saying. I decided to explore the grounds again, thinking maybe I had missed something. The exterior of the hotel was just as unwelcoming. The view of the Tequendama Falls was spectacular, but it was also haunting. I stood on the terrace, trying to shake off the feeling of dread that had settled over me. The falls roared below, the mist swirling like ghosts of the past. I couldn't help but imagine the stories of people jumping into those depths, their despair mingling with the water. Back inside, I wandered through the hotel's various rooms, each one a snapshot of the past. The furniture was old, covered in dust, and the air was thick with the scent of neglect. I ran my fingers over the surfaces, feeling the layers of grime and disuse. As I moved from room to room, the feeling of being watched returned. I could almost hear whispers coming from the corners, but whenever I stopped to listen, the sounds faded. In one of the rooms, I found an old journal. The pages were yellowed and fragile. I carefully opened it, revealing scrawled entries about strange occurrences and a growing sense of dread. One entry caught my eye. "The rooms are restless. It's as if something wants us to join it." The handwriting was shaky, the words frantic. I had seen that same look in the woman's eyes earlier. What were they all afraid of? My skin prickled as I read on. The journal spoke of visions and encounters, not unlike what I had experienced. The final entry was a desperate plea for help, cut off abruptly. I closed the journal, feeling a weight settle in my stomach. I needed to get out, but my legs felt like they were stuck to the floor. It was as if the hotel was holding me captive, refusing to let me leave until I uncovered the truth. As I turned to leave, the lights flickered. The temperature seemed to drop suddenly, my breath visible in the cold air. I glanced around, and the figure from before was back, standing in the doorway. It had the same empty, hollow face, staring directly at me. I was frozen, unable to move. The figure raised a hand and pointed toward the stairs. I had no choice but to follow. The air grew colder as I ascended the stairs. My heart raced, and my steps felt heavy. The figure led me to the same room where I had seen it before. I entered, and the room was empty again. The figure was gone, but the sense of being watched was even stronger. I knew I had to confront whatever was haunting this place, but I was terrified of what I might find. The figure's sudden disappearance left me with a growing unease. I couldn't shake the feeling that something crucial was slipping through my fingers. I moved through the empty corridors, each step echoing louder than the last. Every room seemed the same, darkened, dusty, and silent. The oppressive atmosphere felt almost tangible, wrapping around me like a shroud. I entered what appeared to be a library, its shelves lined with old, leather-bound books. A faint smell of mildew filled the air. I pulled a book from a shelf, its cover brittle. As I leafed through the pages, something slid out and fell to the floor. It was a photograph, black and white, showing a group of people standing in front of the hotel. They were dressed in early 20th century clothing, their expressions solemn. There was one face that stood out among them, an older woman with sharp eyes. I didn't recognize her, but there was something unsettling about her gaze. I felt a shiver as I realized she resembled the woman I'd spoken to earlier. My mind raced. Could she have been involved in the hotel's history? The idea gnawed at me. I had to find out more. I left the library and wandered back to the lobby, hoping the old woman would be there. She wasn't. I approached the desk, where I found a young man now working. I introduced myself again, explaining that I needed more information about the hotel's past. He seemed nervous, glancing around as if worried about saying too much. "It's not a good idea to dig into the history," he said, his voice trembling slightly. "People who get too involved, well, they don't always leave the way they came." His warning was cryptic, but filled with dread. I asked about the photograph I had found, but he merely shook his head and turned away. The evening brought an unexpected chill, and the hotel seemed even more foreboding. I decided to venture outside, thinking a walk would clear my mind. The view of the Tequendama Falls was as striking as ever, but the sight of the cascading water now felt ominous. The legend of people leaping into the falls haunted me. Was this connected to what was happening in the hotel? As I walked the grounds, the faint sound of a bell rang in the distance. It was strange, as I hadn't seen any bell towers or similar structures. I followed the sound, which grew louder and more insistent. The bell led me to a secluded garden, overgrown and tangled with vines. The sound stopped abruptly, leaving me alone with my thoughts. A sudden gust of wind rustled through the leaves, and the temperature dropped sharply. I felt a presence behind me and turned to see the figure again, standing at the edge of the garden. It was closer this time, its hollow eyes fixed on me. My heart raced, and I felt the urge to flee, but my feet were rooted to the spot. The figure raised its hand, pointing towards an old stone structure, partially hidden by the undergrowth. I approached it hesitantly. The structure was an old well, its opening covered with a rusty grate. My hands trembled as I reached for the grate. It moved with surprising ease, revealing a dark, deep void below. Peering into the well, I saw nothing but darkness. The chill in the air grew more intense, and a low whisper seemed to emanate from the depths. I leaned in closer, straining to hear. The whispers grew louder, forming coherent words. "Help us, save us." I recoiled, my mind racing. The connection between the hotel's dark past and the figure's cryptic behavior was becoming clearer. It seemed the well was a focal point of the hauntings. What happened here was not just folklore, but something far more sinister. The revelation hit me hard. The hotel's history was not just about the past, but a living nightmare, tied to those who had never truly left. When I first saw the Villisca Axe murder house, I felt a mix of curiosity and unease. Its dark, weathered exterior stood in stark contrast to the bright autumn afternoon. My friends and I had come for the thrill of exploring what's touted as one of the most haunted places in America. The house, preserved in its 1912 state, was both a historic artifact and a magnet for those seeking the supernatural. Inside, the air was thick with a musty odor, a lingering reminder of decades of decay. The walls, lined with old wallpaper peeling at the edges, seemed to pulse with a story of their own. My flashlight beam flickered over the old furnishings, an ancient rocking chair, a threadbare rug, and photographs of long-gone residents. The setting felt eerily static, as if waiting for something to happen. As I walked through the narrow, creaking hallways, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every shadow seemed to stretch a little longer, every creak of the floorboards louder than usual. My friends chuckled nervously, their voices bouncing off the walls in a hollow echo. Despite their bravado, I noticed them glancing over their shoulders more frequently, their jokes falling flat. One of the most unsettling aspects of the house was its layout. The rooms were small and claustrophobic, their furnishings arranged as though frozen in time. The old beds and wooden furniture looked as though they might have witnessed something terrible. I tried to shake off the unease by engaging in idle chatter, but my attempts to lighten the mood felt increasingly out of place. We decided to split up for a while, each of us exploring different parts of the house. I ventured into the kitchen, where the sight of the old, rusted stove and grimy sink seemed to bring the past to life. The room felt colder than the rest of the house. The floorboards groaned under my weight, amplifying the stillness around me. Every creak felt like a response to my intrusion. In the living room, I stood still and tried to listen. The only sounds were the distant thud of footsteps from my friends and the occasional gust of wind rattling the windows. My breath seemed too loud in the otherwise quiet space. I couldn't help but wonder about the horrific events that had unfolded here. 6 children and 2 adults, their lives brutally ended. Suddenly, a sharp noise from the upstairs bedrooms made my heart race. I started up the stairs, each step heavy with the anticipation of finding something, anything, that might explain the sense of dread creeping over me. The old staircase seemed to groan in protest with each step, heightening my anxiety. My flashlight's beam danced over the walls, casting erratic shadows that only added to the tension. When I reached the top, the hallway was just as unsettling as before. The rooms were dark, with the faintest hint of moonlight filtering through cracked windows. I felt a chill run down my spine. My friends had mentioned feeling watched, but now, in the quiet solitude, I couldn't ignore the sensation of being followed. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. I turned back to find my friends. The thought of continuing alone felt increasingly unappealing. The house seemed to have its own pulse, a slow, sinister rhythm that made every moment feel drawn out. I was eager to regroup and share the unnerving feelings we'd all experienced so far. As I descended the stairs, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to go terribly wrong. I had just managed to regroup with my friends in the main hall when the atmosphere shifted. It was subtle at first, an odd draft that seemed to swirl around us, making the temperature drop suddenly. I tried to laugh it off, but the unease among us was palpable. "Hey, did you guys feel that?" I asked, trying to mask my own discomfort. Mike, one of my friends, nodded, his face looking as unsettled as mine felt. "Yeah, I thought it was just me. It's freezing in here all of a sudden." He glanced around nervously, his flashlight trembling slightly. We all exchanged uneasy looks, our initial bravado now overshadowed by a creeping sense of dread. As we moved through the rooms again, the house seemed to come alive with strange noises. We heard the faintest thud coming from above, almost like footsteps. But when we checked, the upper floor was empty. I could see the shadows playing tricks with our minds. The dark corners seemed to pulse with a life of their own, heightening my anxiety. My friend Sarah suggested we use a voice recorder to capture any potential paranormal activity. We set it up in the living room and tried to joke around to keep our spirits up. But even our laughter seemed hollow. The old wooden floors groaned underfoot, amplifying every slight movement, making it hard to differentiate between real sounds and imagined ones. While Sarah and Mike fiddled with the recorder, I wandered into the dining room. The table set with old dishes and a worn tablecloth seemed almost mocking in its normalcy. I ran my fingers over the dust-covered surface, feeling a chill that had nothing to do with the draft. The stillness of the room was unsettling. I could hear my own heartbeat thumping loudly in my ears. I decided to check the basement, thinking that maybe some isolation would calm my nerves. Descending the stairs, the musty smell grew stronger. The basement was cluttered with old furniture and boxes covered in dust. I pulled out my flashlight, casting an uneven beam over the cobwebbed corners. The darkness here felt thicker, more oppressive. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was intruding on something that didn't want to be disturbed. Suddenly, I heard a loud crash from the upper floor. My heart raced as I sprinted back upstairs, the sound of my footsteps loud and frantic. "Guys, what was that?" I shouted, my voice trembling. I found Mike and Sarah looking just as alarmed as I felt. "We need to find out what's going on," Mike said, his face pale. We decided to split up again, each of us searching different parts of the house. I went to the kitchen, feeling an inexplicable pull. The room was darker than before, the shadows seeming to shift as I moved. I noticed a strange chill on my skin, as if someone had just brushed past me. I tried to ignore it, but the sense of being watched intensified. As I returned to the hallway, I caught a glimpse of something out of the corner of my eye, a shadow darting across the wall. I stopped, holding my breath, and watched as the shape moved with an almost deliberate slowness. It was like being drawn into a nightmare where every detail was both horrifying and mesmerizing. I needed to tell my friends, but my voice was caught in my throat, fear gripping me tightly. The hall seemed darker now, the shadows more oppressive. I gripped my flashlight tighter, the beam barely cutting through the thickness of the gloom. I could hear my friends' voices somewhere in the distance, their attempts to make light of the situation failing to mask the rising tension. "Sarah, Mike, where are you?" I called out, my voice cracking. A sudden noise made me jump. It sounded like something or someone scraping against the walls. I turned, but the corridor was empty. The chill that had settled over me deepened. I felt an odd sensation of being watched, as if invisible eyes were tracking my every movement. My breathing quickened, and I forced myself to keep moving. I stumbled into a room that I hadn't noticed before. The air was stale, filled with the musty smell of old books and damp wood. The room was lined with antique furniture, each piece looking like it had been frozen in time. As I ran my fingers over the surface of a dusty chair, a strange, cold sensation touched my skin. It was as if the room itself was trying to communicate something, but I couldn't decipher its message. Sarah's voice came through the darkness, sounding frantic. "I think we need to regroup," she said. I hurried towards the sound, finding her and Mike in the living room. Their faces were tense, their eyes wide. "Something's not right," Mike said, his voice barely above a whisper. "This place is messing with our heads." We decided to take a break, hoping that the calm would bring clarity. I sank onto a worn couch, the springs creaking beneath me. I tried to focus on something other than the unsettling atmosphere, but the oppressive weight of the house seemed to bear down on me. Every creak, every distant thud made me jump, my nerves frayed. As we sat in the dim light of our flashlights, I glanced at the old grandfather clock in the corner. It was stopped at 12:45, the same time the 1912 murders were said to have begun. A shiver ran down my spine. "It's just a coincidence," I muttered, but my voice lacked conviction. The clock's presence seemed more than a mere fixture. It felt like a marker of some ongoing, unspoken horror. We decided to investigate the basement again, thinking it might be the source of the disturbances. The steps down felt steeper this time, each one echoing ominously. The basement was even colder than before. My flashlight flickered, casting eerie shadows on the walls. The feeling of dread was almost tangible. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was just nerves, but the fear persisted. In the basement's far corner, I noticed a door slightly ajar. I approached it, my heart pounding. As I pushed the door open, the hinges groaned in protest. Inside, there were old trunks and more dusty furniture. I reached out to examine a trunk, but as I touched it, a sudden sharp pain shot through my hand. I pulled back, my breath coming in quick, shallow bursts. Just then, I heard a muffled cry, a voice, not quite human, but filled with raw, unsettling emotion. "Did you hear that?" I asked, turning to my friends. They nodded, their faces pale and stricken with fear. We exchanged nervous glances, all of us understanding that whatever was happening, it was far beyond the ordinary. We gathered in the living room, trying to piece together what we had experienced. The atmosphere felt more charged than before, each creak and groan of the house amplifying our fear. We debated leaving, but something kept us tethered to the house, an unspoken agreement to confront whatever we had awakened. The night was far from over, and the true horror had yet to reveal itself. As the hours dragged on, the house seemed to close in on us. Every shadow appeared more menacing, every sound more sinister. The old wooden floorboards creaked as if they were alive, reacting to our presence. Sarah, Mike, and I huddled together in the living room, our breaths visible in the cold, damp air. The sense of unease was nearly suffocating. "We should check the upstairs again," I suggested, my voice barely masking my anxiety. "Maybe we missed something." Sarah looked at me, her eyes wide and filled with fear. "Are you sure?" she asked. "We've been up there already." I nodded, unable to shake the feeling that something crucial was eluding us. We climbed the narrow staircase, each step echoing through the empty house. My flashlight illuminated the way, but the beam seemed to struggle against the darkness. I glanced back at my friends, their faces pale and drawn. "Stay close," I said, trying to sound reassuring. The staircase seemed to stretch endlessly, as if the house was playing tricks on our perception. At the top, we entered a bedroom that felt colder than the rest of the house. The room was sparsely furnished, with a single bed draped in an old, tattered quilt. The window was open slightly, allowing the chill to seep in. I approached the bed, feeling an almost magnetic pull. The quilt seemed to shift on its own, as if someone or something was lying beneath it. Mike let out a soft gasp. "Look at this," he said, pointing to a small, faded photograph on the nightstand. I moved closer, my heart racing. The photo showed a family, but their faces were obscured by shadow. A chill ran down my spine as I realized the photo resembled the old images we'd seen in historical records of the original occupants. "Is this?" I started, but my voice trailed off. As I picked up the photograph, a sudden gust of wind slammed the bedroom door shut. We all jumped, the sound reverberating through the room. Sarah's eyes were wide with terror. "We need to get out of here," she said, her voice trembling. "Now." I nodded, but my legs felt like lead. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Suddenly, a loud crash came from the attic. The noise was deafening, shaking the walls. "What the hell was that?" Mike yelled. We exchanged frightened glances, then headed towards the attic. Each step felt heavier than the last. I could barely focus, my mind racing with thoughts of what we might find. Reaching the attic, I noticed the door was slightly ajar. The attic was cluttered with old furniture and boxes, their contents obscured by layers of dust. The air was colder here, and the shadows seemed to move on their own. As we stepped inside, I felt an overwhelming sense of dread. It was as if the house was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. A low, mournful sound filled the attic, like a child's sob. We froze, straining to hear over the noise of our own racing hearts. "Is someone there?" I called out, my voice shaking. No answer came. Instead, the sound grew louder, more desperate. I looked around, the fear almost paralyzing me. Something was deeply wrong, and it was closing in. I turned to my friends, only to find that they had gone silent, their faces frozen in expressions of horror. "What's happening?" I asked, but they didn't respond. I realized then that I was alone in the attic. The noise grew louder, more insistent, as if trying to break through some unseen barrier. I took a deep breath and moved towards the source of the sound, my flashlight flickering. I had to know what was behind it all. The attic seemed to shift, the shadows growing darker and more oppressive. I felt an almost physical pull, drawing me closer to the source of the sound. My flashlight dimmed, leaving me in near darkness. I reached out, my hand trembling, trying to make sense of the chaos that surrounded me. Something was waiting for me, and I was about to find out what. As I edged closer to the source of the noise, the darkness seemed to grow more oppressive. My flashlight sputtered, casting eerie shadows that danced across the cluttered attic. The sobbing intensified, a chilling reminder of the house's dark past. Every instinct screamed at me to turn back, but curiosity and a strange, stubborn resolve kept me moving forward. My hands shook as I brushed aside an old cobweb-covered sheet from a large object. The sheet fell away, revealing an old wardrobe. The sound of crying came from within. I hesitated, my breath shallow. "Is anyone there?" I called out, but only the sobbing answered me. The noise was louder now, almost as if it was coming from inside my head. I gripped the wardrobe door and pulled it open with a creak that echoed around the attic. Inside was a dusty, forgotten mirror. Its surface was obscured by years of grime and spiderwebs. The crying was now a near-constant hum. I reached out to clean the mirror, my fingers trembling as they brushed away the dust. The glass revealed nothing but a reflection of the dim attic and my own pale, frightened face. As I wiped the mirror clean, something shifted in the reflection. At first, it was just a shadow, almost imperceptible. But then, the shadow began to take shape. I could see a figure standing behind me. My heart pounded, and I spun around, but there was no one there. The attic was empty except for me and the ominous mirror. I turned back to the mirror, and the figure was still there, clearer now. It was a man, holding an axe. His face was obscured by a dark hood, but the axe was unmistakable. The figure seemed to move closer with each passing second. Panic surged through me, but my legs felt like they were glued to the spot. I could barely breathe, my mind racing with questions. Who was this man? What was he doing in the mirror? The sobbing grew louder, now accompanied by a faint, disturbing laughter. I turned to find the source, but saw nothing. The mirror's reflection seemed to be the only thing that mattered. The man in the mirror raised the axe, and I could feel the weight of it pressing down on me. I wanted to scream, to run, but my voice was trapped in my throat. I took a deep breath and grabbed my phone, trying to record the mirror. As the camera flashed, the image in the mirror flickered. For a moment, the man was gone, replaced by the image of a child's face, crying in terror. I felt a chill run through me. The scene shifted again, and the axe-wielding man returned, now looking directly at me, as if he could see me through the mirror. I couldn't take it any longer. I turned away from the mirror and stumbled backward, bumping into a stack of old boxes. The sound of the axe hitting wood echoed through the attic, though no physical axe was present. I had to get out of there. I raced down the stairs, not daring to look back. The sobbing and the laughter followed me, growing fainter as I reached the front door. Outside, the night air was cold and biting, but it felt like a relief compared to the terror inside. My friends were waiting for me at the car, their faces filled with concern. I could hardly explain what had happened, my voice trembling as I tried to recount the events. All I knew was that the house had taken something from me, a part of my sanity I couldn't retrieve. The Villisca Axe murder house stood behind me, its dark windows like empty eyes watching my every move. I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had been in that mirror was still there, waiting. The experience left a lingering sense of dread. Even now, as I look back, I can't escape the feeling that the reflection in that mirror was not just a part of the house's dark history, but a glimpse into something far more sinister. Christmas 2013 was a flurry of excitement and chaos in our house. My kids, ages 5 and 7, were over the moon when they unwrapped their gifts. Among the pile of toys and games, there was the Disney Frozen Elsa doll. It was supposed to be a special treat. My wife and I smiled as the kids hugged the doll, pressing its necklace button to hear it sing "Let It Go." The doll's voice was crisp and cheerful, just like the movie. For the first few weeks, it was a hit. The kids loved the doll. They played with it every day, and the song from the movie became a soundtrack to our home. We didn't think much of it when the doll began speaking in both English and Spanish. It was a novelty at first, and we assumed it was part of its charm. A little glitch, perhaps. It wasn't until 2015 that things started to shift. The doll's behavior became less predictable. Sometimes it would sing in Spanish without warning. There was no button to change the language, and the randomness began to unsettle me. I tried to explain it away as a malfunction, but it didn't sit right. It was like the doll had its own mind. The first time the doll sang "Let It Go" in Spanish in the middle of the night, I remember waking up in a cold sweat. I rushed to the kids' room, only to find them sleeping soundly. The doll, placed on a shelf, was silent. The house was quiet, but my mind raced. Why was it doing this? I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. By December 2019, my patience had worn thin. The doll's random singing was no longer just a nuisance, it had become eerie. We decided to throw it away. It felt like a relief. I hoped that was the end of it. But a few weeks later, as I was cleaning up the living room, I found the doll. It was tucked away inside a bench where we had thrown out the trash. The kids were adamant they didn't retrieve it. They were puzzled and a little frightened when they saw it again. I was convinced they were telling the truth. We had thrown the doll away with no intention of seeing it again. Yet, there it was, like a bad joke that just wouldn't end. I couldn't explain how it got back into the house. It wasn't just the doll's return that disturbed me, it was its new behavior. Now it only spoke in Spanish, and every time you pressed its necklace, it would say phrases we hadn't heard before. The randomness had taken on a new edge. I couldn't ignore the growing sense of dread every time the doll's voice filled the room. We tried to get rid of it again, this time wrapping it up tightly and placing it at the very bottom of the trash bin. It was meant to be a final farewell. We even went on a trip, hoping the distance would offer some peace. But when we returned home, the doll was waiting for us. It was outside, in the backyard, untouched and in the same place we had left it. By then, the doll's presence had become a source of constant tension. It seemed to be following us, and no matter what we did, it always came back. We had to do something drastic. That's when we decided to send it to a family friend in Minnesota. Maybe, just maybe, it would stay away from us if it was far enough. Sending the Elsa doll to Minnesota felt like a desperate but necessary step. We hoped that a friend of ours, Brian, who had a cabin up there, could keep it away from us. We shipped it off with a mix of relief and lingering anxiety. Maybe, we thought, the distance would finally break the doll's hold over our lives. 2 years passed without incident. We managed to forget about the doll, or at least tried to. The kids had moved on to other toys, and I tried to put the whole creepy episode behind me. Life went on, filled with everyday routines and holiday preparations that had nothing to do with haunted dolls. Then, last Christmas, I received a phone call from Brian. He sounded unsettled, his voice tight with tension. "Hey, "I need to talk to you about something," he said. My heart sank. Brian had been a reliable friend, and I could tell this wasn't going to be a pleasant conversation. "I've been having trouble with the doll," Brian confessed. "It's been acting strange ever since you sent it. I thought you should know." His words brought back a flood of unease. I didn't understand how the doll could be causing trouble so far from us. Curiosity got the best of me, and I asked Brian to elaborate. He told me that the doll had been sitting on the front bumper of his truck as a grim reminder of our shared nightmare. It seemed to be working fine at first, but then strange things started happening. The doll would speak on its own, sometimes softly, sometimes loudly, reciting phrases we hadn't programmed into it. Brian was frustrated. "I even took the batteries out," he said. "It still talks. I thought maybe it was the cold or something. But nothing's changed. The doll just won't stay quiet." I could hear the exasperation in his voice, and it made my skin crawl. I wanted to dismiss it as another malfunction, but something in Brian's tone made me doubt that explanation. I asked if he'd seen anything else strange. He hesitated before admitting that the doll had begun singing "Let It Go" in Spanish more frequently than ever. The change was sudden, and the lyrics seemed to be different from what it had originally sung. The news unsettled me deeply. The doll's behavior had always been erratic, but this new development suggested something beyond simple electronics going haywire. Brian's frustration was palpable. "I don't know what to do with it," he said. "It's becoming more than just annoying." That was when I decided to go visit Brian. I needed to see the doll for myself, to understand if there was something more going on. The journey to Minnesota felt like a dark omen, a return to a problem I thought I had left behind. The snow-covered roads seemed to reflect the uncertainty and dread that had begun creeping back into my life. When I arrived at Brian's cabin, he met me with a grim expression. The doll was exactly where he'd left it, still on the truck's bumper. Seeing it again, its plastic smile and lifeless eyes, was like a punch to the gut. I felt a shiver as I reached out to touch it. It felt strangely warm, as if it had a life of its own. Brian and I decided to inspect the doll together. It was still reciting phrases, but now in an eerie, almost mechanical voice. There was no sign of a malfunction. It was as if it was deliberately trying to communicate. We looked at each other, both of us knowing this was beyond anything we had imagined. My mind raced with possibilities. How could a doll, so innocuous and commercial, become such a source of terror? It seemed to mock us, and every phrase it spoke felt like a taunt. The sense of foreboding grew stronger. Whatever we thought we had contained was now threatening to break free once again. As Brian and I stared at the doll, a mix of disbelief and dread settled over us. Its cheerful smile felt like a cruel joke, especially as it began to sing a distorted version of "Let It Go." I couldn't shake the feeling that it was mocking us, reminding us of how powerless we had felt before. Brian's frown deepened as he reached for it, hesitating just long enough for me to notice. "Why does it feel like it knows us?" he muttered, his eyes narrowing as he inspected the doll. "Like it's playing some kind of game." I nodded, the weight of his words sinking in. This wasn't just a toy anymore. It felt like an entity, a presence that could sense our fear. "Let's bring it inside," I suggested, despite the unease swirling in my gut. There was no escaping the sense of inevitability that hung over us. We had to confront it head-on, even if that felt like a terrible idea. I couldn't help but think about the first time we had found it talking without anyone pressing its buttons, how we had tossed it away, hoping to rid ourselves of its influence. Inside Brian's cabin, the atmosphere was thick with tension. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows, and the cabin felt colder than it should have. The walls were adorned with pictures of happier times, memories that now felt tainted. I could hear the faint sound of the doll still singing, almost as if it was resonating within the very wood of the cabin. I placed the doll on the dining table, its smile gleaming under the overhead light. "What if we just destroy it?" I suggested, my voice barely above a whisper. Brian looked at me, his expression a mixture of fear and confusion. "And risk it coming back again. We've seen how that works," he replied, rubbing his temples as if trying to dispel the memories. We decided to document everything. Brian grabbed his phone, filming as we sat across from the doll, our breaths almost synchronized. "Let's see what it does," I said, trying to sound braver than I felt. As the camera rolled, I pressed the button on the doll's necklace, and it immediately sprang to life, its voice echoing through the room, mixing with the howl of the wind outside. "Do you want to build a snowman?" it chirped, the cheerful tune only deepening the chill that ran through me. I glanced at Brian, who looked pale and tense. "How is it even doing this?" I questioned, the reality of our situation dawning on me. No batteries, no buttons to press, yet it continued to perform, defying all logic. Brian leaned forward, brow furrowed. "Maybe we can find out what triggers it," he suggested, his curiosity overpowering his fear. "Let's test it." I agreed reluctantly, not fully understanding why we would willingly provoke whatever force had taken hold of this doll. We took turns pressing the button, each attempt eliciting a new phrase or song, always in that unnervingly cheerful voice. As we recorded, I noticed something odd. The doll's phrases began to change, becoming increasingly erratic. It spoke in a mixture of English and Spanish, sometimes mixing the two languages in a way that felt deliberate. "Why is it doing this?" I asked, my heart racing. It was as if the doll was responding to our emotions, feeding off the tension that had built between us. Suddenly, the room grew eerily quiet. The doll had stopped singing, but something else filled the air, an unsettling stillness. Brian and I exchanged worried glances. "Did you hear that?" he asked, eyes wide. I nodded, the tension palpable. It felt as if the walls were closing in on us, the cabin itself holding its breath, waiting for something to unfold. Just then, the doll let out a soft chuckle, startling both of us. "Time to play," it sang, the words chilling me to the core. I felt a wave of nausea wash over me. This wasn't just a toy anymore. It was an intruder in our lives, something dark and unfathomable. Whatever we thought we could control had now taken on a life of its own. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were just beginning to scratch the surface of this nightmare. The doll wasn't done with us yet, and as I looked into its soulless eyes, I knew we were in deeper than we could have ever imagined. The nights since we'd brought the doll into the cabin had been unsettling. I could hardly sleep, haunted by the sound of its voice drifting through the dark. The wind outside only seemed to amplify its eerie sing-along, making the cabin feel more isolated and suffocating. I could never pinpoint the exact moment I would hear the doll's voice. It just seemed to come out of nowhere, often when I was least expecting it. One evening, I woke up to the sound of someone humming. At first, I thought it was Brian. I reached out, feeling the cold spot where he should have been. I turned on the lamp beside the bed and saw him still asleep, his face relaxed, oblivious to the sounds. The humming continued, a haunting rendition of "Let It Go," and it took me a moment to realize it was coming from the living room. I crept down the hall, every floorboard creaking under my weight. My heart pounded with every step, my breathing growing shallow. The hallway seemed endless, shadows dancing on the walls as if taunting me. When I reached the living room, the doll sat on the coffee table, its eyes glinting in the dim light. It was singing the song in Spanish now, and I could swear the volume seemed louder than usual. "Why are you doing this?" I whispered to the doll, even though I knew it couldn't answer. My hands trembled as I reached out to turn it off, but before I could, it stopped mid-verse. The sudden silence was almost more unsettling than the song. I felt a chill run down my spine, my mind racing to make sense of the situation. Brian joined me in the living room, his face pale as he saw the doll. "It's doing it again," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I nodded, unable to offer any explanation. We had tried everything, removing the batteries, storing it away, but it always found its way back. Each attempt to get rid of it only seemed to strengthen its hold over us. We decided to document the latest occurrence, setting up the camera to capture the doll in action. As Brian started filming, I noticed the doll's mouth moving, but no sound was coming out. It was as if the doll was trying to speak but couldn't. Brian looked at me, concern etched across his face. "It's like it's mocking us," he said, his voice tight with frustration. The camera continued to roll, and suddenly, the doll's eyes seemed to follow us. I shook my head, trying to dismiss the feeling of being watched. "We need to get rid of it for good," I said firmly. Brian agreed, though I saw doubt in his eyes. He was as frightened as I was, but neither of us knew how to end this nightmare. After filming, we wrapped the doll in several layers of plastic and stuffed it in a trash bag. The sound of the plastic rustling felt oddly loud in the stillness of the cabin. Brian took the bag outside, placing it in the trash bin with an air of finality. We both hoped that this time it would stay gone, but deep down, I knew better. The doll had a way of finding its way back, and I feared it would do so again. The following morning, I woke up to a familiar sound, an unnerving melody coming from the yard. I went outside, hoping to find some logical explanation. To my horror, there it was, the doll sitting on the front steps, facing the house. It was singing softly, "Let It Go" in Spanish. The plastic was still wrapped around it, but somehow it had returned. Brian joined me, his face a mask of disbelief. "How is this even possible?" he asked, his voice filled with exasperation. I had no answer. I could only watch as Brian picked up the doll, its eyes seemingly gleaming with a malevolent satisfaction. We were out of ideas and options. I knew then that the doll was no longer just a toy. It was something far more sinister, and it wouldn't stop until it had what it wanted. The days following Elsa's return were filled with dread. Despite our efforts, it was clear that no matter how far we tried to push her away, the doll always made its way back. The constant feeling of being watched gnawed at me. I could no longer ignore the sense of unease that seemed to follow every step I took, every breath I drew. We decided to take a more drastic approach. We arranged for a family friend in Minnesota to take Elsa off our hands. They agreed, though with visible hesitation. Brian and I drove the doll to their house, our every movement shadowed by a sense of looming dread. As soon as we handed it over, we hoped we were finally rid of the cursed thing. Minnesota seemed to offer a brief respite. For a while, Elsa's disturbing presence was gone, and life felt almost normal again. I started to let my guard down, believing that perhaps we had finally escaped the nightmare. But one evening, an email arrived that shattered my fragile peace. It was a message from our friend, accompanied by a photo of Elsa strapped to the front bumper of their truck. The doll had somehow returned. The photo was unsettling. Elsa's eyes glinted under the streetlights, her mouth twisted into what looked like a grin. I stared at the image, feeling a cold sweat break out on my forehead. I tried to convince myself it was a cruel joke, but deep down, I knew the truth. The doll was relentless, and it had found its way back to us yet again. Brian was as shaken as I was. "This can't be happening," he said, his voice a mix of disbelief and frustration. We debated what to do next, but each option seemed increasingly desperate. The idea of sending Elsa somewhere else crossed our minds, but every attempt had ended in failure. The doll's unyielding persistence was beginning to take its toll on us. One night, after a particularly tense day, I woke up to an unusual sound, a soft, rhythmic tapping coming from the living room. My heart raced as I crept out of bed, the darkness swallowing my footsteps. The tapping continued, punctuated by the faintest trace of Elsa's song. As I approached the living room, I saw the doll sitting on the floor, its head turned slightly, as if watching me. I reached for the doll, my hands trembling. As soon as my fingers brushed its plastic surface, the tapping stopped abruptly. I felt an overwhelming sense of being watched. The room felt colder, the air thick with an unseen presence. Elsa's eyes seemed to follow my every movement, her mouth forming the words of "Let It Go" in Spanish without a sound. Desperate, I wrapped the doll in a thick blanket and shoved it into the closet, sealing the door with a heavy weight. I needed to think clearly, but the persistent feeling of dread left me on edge. I could barely focus, the thought of Elsa lurking just beyond the closet door, gnawing at my sanity. The next morning, I found the closet door wide open. The blanket was on the floor, and Elsa sat in the middle of the room, smiling as if she had just been waiting for me. I froze, my mind racing to make sense of the impossibility. Brian and I exchanged looks of sheer panic, unable to comprehend how the doll had escaped the closet. With no more options left, we decided to call in a professional. An expert in paranormal phenomena visited our home, examining the doll with a mix of skepticism and curiosity. After a thorough investigation, the expert offered an unsettling revelation. Elsa was not just a cursed doll, she had been tampered with in a way that defied conventional explanation. The mechanics inside had been altered, allowing it to operate independently of its supposed constraints. The expert's revelation left us in a state of shock. We were finally facing the truth. Elsa was not simply a haunted toy, but a vessel of something far more sinister. We could never truly be rid of it. It would always find a way back. The weight of that realization settled over us, knowing that our nightmare was far from over. In the end, as we prepared for another attempt to rid ourselves of Elsa, I couldn't shake the thought that the doll's presence was not merely a haunting. It was a test, and one we might never truly escape. The thought of Elsa always lurking, just out of sight, filled me with an ever-present dread. As we carried the doll away for what we hoped would be the last time, I knew that the real horror was not the doll itself, but the relentless fear it instilled.